Hello, and welcome to Varn Vlog, the end of the year of 2022. I hope you've all enjoyed your holidays. We've gotten past Hanukkah and Christmas. We're into the part of the year where everyone asks people what Kwanzaa is, and people have long forgotten Diwali. I come to reflect on a year that was, in many ways, one of the more telling political years of my life, and a personal year for me. I mean, a personal year is kind of a ridiculous concept, but it's when I realized some things. I'm sitting down to write now 2 books, maybe 3, because I've been pent up writing stuff and not sharing it for a long time. Some context, and I can't go into too much because some of this touches my extended family. But in the past 3.5 years, I have lost 2 childhood friends, an uncle, many of the people I grew up with, to all kinds of things, COVID, alcoholism, etc. Several friends treated for alcoholism in a way that it has been really hurtful to my extended family back in Georgia. I've had an ex-wife recover from cancer, and my mother continue battling it. I don't normally bring these kinds of personal things out. I talk about my personal life to make political points, usually as anecdotes. But I feel that that needs to be understood about the tenor of what I'm going to say. I've often been accused of being black-pilled. It's almost a running joke. I'm not quite sure I know what black pill means. And as we gear up for the new year, it's something we're going to have to think about. But in a sense, when I was talking with Sean KB, when I've talked with Douglas Lane again after some back channel negotiations, I came to the realization that my positive principles were often misunderstood. And the left critique of the left could become an infinite kind of narcissistic circle jerk. Not new, that's not a new observation at all. But the reason why that's the case is more interesting to me. We must apologize for the bottle. For those of you watching, I try not to drink my soda out of bottles anymore, but every now and then, that's all I have around. To get to the point, this year, however, was hard for me because the investment in the Democratic Party and the foreclosure of that Overton window everyone was so joyously proclaiming moved seemed actually more severe. You see, a lot of the last year has proved to me that the complicatedness of reality as it is, without community in a real sense, not just in a virtual sense, not just in a parasocial sense, is hard to take. It has effects. And the idea that maybe you have been part of not even a con, all right? No one set out to con this, but that there's been a sociological recapitulation and capture of something that you believed in became clear to me in the year in review. this year we've had DSA scandals that have mostly ended up proving that one of the reasons why the DSA doesn't want to punish its electeds, aka it's the squad, only, I believe, 2 of whom are got endorsed and only 3 of whom are members of the DSA anyway, is really because despite its exponential growth from the sectarian left, it doesn't have the money or the people or the location or geography to punish any of its electeds and to hold them to a political program. In many ways, the whole thing has been shown to be kind of captured because its relationship to power was premature. But that's obvious. That I've talked about before. I want you to go back to January and think about what you were hearing. All right, I think about this because it affected people that I was dating, or my parents and my mom's ability to get cancer treatment, or my day job at school, and how much the discourse this year has been confused. We may be talking about how China is misreporting its COVID deaths since it's done zero, since it's realized that the economic cost of zero COVID was probably too much for it to bear, even though it probably won't have the bounce back that she's hoping for. But all states have been doing that this entire time, making it harder to find out what infection rates are. I suggest people go listen to the Deaf Panel podcast episode year in review for 2022 for how this worked in the United States. But it wasn't just the United States. The move towards unmonitored home testing, towards moving everything off the books, towards not tying vaccine data with infection data and death data with vaccine data, etc. All these things were done by the CDC and mostly accepted. Most of the people wanted to move on from them. Also think back to January when you were hearing about Omicron and how it was mild, or how we were getting ready to need to remove masks, which we've all just given up on now. I mean, you started hearing January talk about one-way masking and how it works. There's not a lot of evidence for that, my friends. But also think about what you've heard about the labor movement. See, what's funny is gaslighting has become a term that is often used for just people lying to you instead of slowly lying to you in a way to make you doubt what is going on and what you see. But in this year, there's been some real gaslighting. All right. I want you to think back to January. What was all the workforce news? Most people weren't talking about it. Instead, they were still talking about 2021 supposed striketober, which never happened. Instead, in January, you started getting headlines like this: union membership drops to previous low in 2021. This is from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. All right. This is not just the Washington Journal. Our Economic Policy Institute. Latest data released on unionization is a wake-up call to lawmakers. We must fix our broken system of labor laws. In 2021, 15.8 million workers in the United States were represented by a union, a decline of 581,000 from 2019. The railway strike reminded us that most of those workers aren't even covered by the National Labor Relations Act because they're municipal, federal, or key industries. And I've been trying to remind people of this for a while. But in addition to that, despite union popularity still being high, and this is from August of this year, the American public is back in love with labor unions, but why aren't workers? Now, that's of course, a kind of misleading CNBC poll framing, but there's a truth to it. Gallup poll after Gallup poll indicates that a lot of people aren't entering the unions and feels that they are already unionized. That there's not a lot of demand for an increase of union membership in those areas. But you've been sold from a Democratic president, no less, and definitely from other socialists, that we were in a labor renewal. You can have Doug Hinwood say that, oh, it was only the red states that really had the Great Resignation. Of course, if you look in his fine print, he actually really downplays what happened in California. On policy after policy, not just in the United States, but worldwide, you were sold that the left was winning, and yet in every single case, they have been weak, fractured. Castillo is just the latest of the series of events. You will get some social democrat who will proclaim that this or that pink wave is happening and not look at the fine details and not know the context. They will talk to a few friends from the country and draw whatever conclusion they like from it. And that is not even getting into the catastrophe of the Ukraine war and the fact that we are now in an active position of it's harder and harder to find the truth from anybody. Most of the dissident media is also tweet stenographers and policy readers just for different places than the mainstream media. Someone's got to pay the bills, and you, my friends, aren't. I've been podcasting for 13 years. I am in the upper mid tier of political YouTubers on Patreon. Right. This page has a very small subscriber base, although my Patreon backers are higher than you'd expect from it. Part of that is because I don't monetize it on YouTube, so that it's harder for me to get punished by YouTube when they don't like something that I say. I mean, if I was to violate this or that extreme violation, I would get removed, but that's pretty much what you have to do. Whereas when you're monetized, they can control what you say a lot more readily. And what have we been discussing? What has the discourse been this year? It hasn't been how we didn't really see labor renewal, except in some key areas that are very high profile, Starbucks being one, union battles for graduate students and TAs being another, union battles for Amazon logistics workers. And for every victory, there's also been a loss. And we often don't talk about that. No. Pascal Robert on his birthday call made a plea to me that there had been a movement from Bernie, and that, it hadn't totally be recapitulated because Medicare for all was in people's mouths. And my response to him is going to be my response to you right now. In the next year, the Biden administration takes to fully privatize COVID vaccines and testing. Right? The vaccines will be free to those with insurance, but for most people that without insurance, it will be about $130, and that's only within the United States. All right. So the Medicare for all dream, you can't even get Democrats to discuss it now that there's actually a Democrat in office. And in fact, all the special benefits that we've had, this cessation of capital for fighting public good, has pretty much been abandoned by them. You are further away than you were in 2019. You are further away than you were even in 2016. there's a tendency to want to play fault, to blame the leadership. And yes, the leadership has plenty to blame. And yes, we can get mad at the DSA have been captured. Yes, we can get mad at the hypocrisy of the squad, our first almost entirely social media-based gaggle of politicians. We can be mad at that. But it's not going to fix anything. It's not going to fix anything at all. I didn't go into left-wing media or educational media to help you guys be useful idiots for just a different boss. In 2022, one of the last mini dumpster fire of years, indicated to me that the complexity of the problem and the reductiveness of most of the solutions meant that people were going to get easily played. Anything I've said today can be taken by right-wingers, left-wingers, or liberals and spun in a way that can deactivate you. And they are. I mean, I pointed out that there's an increase in radical rhetoric on things just vaguely adjacent to the Democratic Party. There's a whole wing of the Democratic Party furious with the Supreme Court and talking about the structural problems of the law now. But their answer to it is just popular sovereignty. And by popular sovereignty, they mean progressive values. But they don't want to deal with the fact that this legal regime that they're fighting for was made by the Warren Court because popular opinion was not with liberals in the 1950s. And to remove the possibility of violence, that political contestation got moved to the law, which seems more natural. But that created the Supreme Court regime we have now. In short, the liberal retreat to politics in the mid-20th century in America is why the legal regime in America is the way it is. Conservatives were able to use it. I can't think of a single thing that leftists and liberals have brought up in the last year that have not been successfully more weaponized by the right than they've ever been used by leftists or liberals. And what have leftists done? Instead of scurrying to make their own mind up to finish whatever projects they need to finish, whether they be Marxist or anarchist or whatever, we by and large have tried to tail people to where we thought power already was. The political realities of the situation seem too bleak. We must find heroes, after all. And so while I said very beginning that I am not black-pilled, I am, by and large, looking at the review of the year and thinking, left-wing media was insufficient for this. The left-wing movements in America are legally constrained because they've chosen a national route of development. And what needs to be done needs to be spelled out in different positive principles that are going to seem very abstract to people. I'm often accused of being vague in what I say, that you need to build up para institutions, that you need to build up ways to handle things when you don't have money, that you have to deal with the legitimate social grievances between different groups of people, ethnicities, races, sexualities, etc., without asking anyone to totally subsume what they need, and also without making demands that are impossible on the larger public. That's not an easy thing to do. It's not a set of principles, right? When we argue for something on the left, we should be arguing it because the principle underneath it, or the heuristic underneath it, or the guiding force underneath it should be based on something that everyone involved can materially, socially, mentally, etc. benefit from. Instead of playing the collective and the individual at odds, we need to realize that one is really and truly enriched by the other. And our principles need to do that. And if you think you're just going to run up and do either localism or try to run electoral state apparatus, we have 150 years of failures at both. It is time to start thinking differently. I'm writing an essay at the end of the year. It's going to be a slow-going essay. I have to deal with Les Kolakowski again and a bunch of other stuff. But about why both the idea of the left going all the way back to its initiation in the French Revolution isn't all that clarifying a lot of the time, but attempts to go beyond left and right almost always end up favoring the status quo, and thus either being conservative or reactionary, depending on how rigorously and vigorously they favor the status quo. I'm trying to figure out what in that way of speaking, in that way of thinking, leads to that cul-de-sac, whereas the left is defined as both progressive but not progressing towards anything, but against the status quo as a negation of the status quo. Fine, but also that this negation is unclear, it is vague, it is on way too many complex subjects, and thus nobody can really talk about what they actually mean, what their programs really are. Yes, we can talk about political programs, but what are the heuristics guiding those programs? I mean, I am still a believer that programmatic unity is the only meaningful unity for a political movement, any political movement, not just a left-wing one, right? If we can't all be the same identity, we can't all be the same kind of person. That's an impossible thing to ask. So what can we do what kind of program can we make that is beneficial for all? But that has to be based in actual heuristics, and those heuristics need to be based off of actual material development. And those don't just need to be vague slogans that Marxists threw out, the hand wave things away. It's easy to be angry. In some ways, it's harder to sit with it, to quit making excuses for it, to be sad. I started talking about what I've lost in the past 3 years and the friends that I've lost, what I've seen happen as working class America that I'm from has been mostly lumpenized. I am only 42 years old, and I don't look that old, I admit it, but I am. I think back to the community I come from. It was a mixed race community, and I was on the odds of it. And at 42, my friends that weren't upper middle class, and I was in a weird state, right? Not a weird state as in a weird, I mean, Georgia is strange, but no, I mean, I was in a weird state of being. I had this, even as a kid, this exposure to the upper middle class that a lot of people didn't have from my background because I was really smart. And so when I was in honors classes, I was rich kids. I mean, well, they weren't rich kids. I thought of them as rich kids. And in reality, they were barely upper middle class kids. The real rich people were in Atlanta or way away from me. The American economic life is so segregated, even more than it is racially or genderly or politically, that you often don't really know what wealth really looks like when you're a poor kid in America, or what like the upper lower middle class. Yes, my stepfather was able to procure us a small house, a very small house. Although in my youth, my earliest youth, I don't remember all this, but we were homeless often, and I was also homeless off and on from 16 to 18. But more people I know who were from my class background from my childhood are dead than not. When we enter, I'm only 42. I don't feel that I can totally out my family, but I will say this, that this affects even people in my larger family. See, that's why I came to left media. I'm actually, I've said this before, but I'm not the right candidate for it. I am a by the bootstraps guy. I mean, ironically, I just achieved the same social mobility as my parents, but I did so by moving probably 2 social classes up. It's just that everything's gotten worse since the 1970s. One of my brothers is a doctor. One of my brothers is in and out of prison. One of my brothers, you know, we have diversified ourselves. I got into Marxism theoretically to explain what I saw in the world when the narratives I got in the right wing weren't answering my questions. Part of it was that the ethnicism and nationalism on the right was I realized, and in 2005 and 2006, 2007, it was not explicit. Okay, it's hard to think back to that time where everybody was still speaking in code, but they were. See, the irony of the Overton window is that it shattered. It didn't just move. See, I'm not downwardly mobile. Most downwardly mobile people are attracted to the left, and I mean, let's be honest about that. The class A people too, but I struggled and believed in my early 20s, not in the American dream. I was never that stupid. I'll tell you what broke me. Right, part of it was the Obama election. Um, First year I taught high school. I taught in a small city outside of Georgia. No, I don't think the Overton window is useful, but I'll get back to that in a minute. A small city outside of Macon, Georgia, very small city. Um, it's about 50% black, 50% white. It's a large county and there's no private school in the area, so you don't have the white fight problems you have in a lot of the other parts of the state. But this is a story of social class and of race. And as Obama comes in, there's a lot of excitement, and a lot of young well, I had a couple of young black men who really excelled. I got them, what I thought were decent scholarships. I really worked with them. I really cared about it. I was really worried about how white the honors class was. Not because I wanted to do the trick that liberals do now and get rid of the honors class, but I wanted it to be rigorous. But I knew from teaching my students that many of my students could do it. It's just that only a lot of the white students knew what to ask for to get there. And we pushed this and we pushed this, and I one of the women that I got in college my first year, the Obama election happens. I'm souring, and I walk into a Walgreens and she's there, and I'm surprised because we worked so hard to get her a scholarship. And she had a baby, and she told me that after having the baby, she had to drop out of college. And look, I'm not a person who believes that college is necessarily going to fix everyone's problems. But she had a year's worth of college debt, and she had to work off, and so she wasn't sure that she was just not worse off for the wear. It was only a year, probably was $3,000 or $4,000, but when you're a single mother in exurban Georgia, that's a lot. And while I'd already been moving away from any right-wing narratives I have, that was the moment when I broke with liberalism. It was the moment. You see, because colleges were getting more diverse at the time, and they're probably more racially diverse now than they've ever been in the United States, and yet they're less economically diverse now than they've ever been. Study after study confirms that. Another thing that we talk about this year. So instead of, we ask who the race is, but we don't ask who the people are. The next year, I leave the country. A variety of complicated reasons. I was going to get laid off. I was asked to do things for NCLB that I thought was immoral. So I went and got into a program at Mercer University. And then I realized that I couldn't support myself and my spouse, who lost her job as well during the economic downturn. It took a while, but she did. She lost it in 2009. And in desperation, I reached out to a friend who said, look, I might have a university job for you. It's just going to be a little bit unconventional. And he really didn't go into much more than this. I mean, this sounds absurd, but this is true. He came back to me a week later. It's like, the committee likes your thing. And, I pulled some strings for you because, let's be honest, even when you're meritocratic, you still got to have friends in high places. And I get a job in South Korea as a lecturer, non-tenure track, but not adjunct, benefits, housing, everything. Hell, they even helped pay for me to move. It was more viable for me to move to South Korea than it was for me to move in the US for a different job. See, one of the things about liberalism is it tends to pretend that this system could be fair. And that's what was broke for me. And when I left and saw the rest of the world, and yeah, I mean, you can comment about stuff you see in the back of my wall. Yeah, I've traveled around the world. That's usually a privilege of the super rich. Let's be honest. I got lucky. I got people to pay for it for me, and I made enough money that I could do it while I was gone too. And let's not deny the power of the US dollar in that, because it's when I really started looking at even more closely global economics, because on paper I made no money, but man, I had some purchasing power. then Occupy happened, etc. I started doing that, and the rest of it's more already told. But I'm looking back now, and I have to question. I've questioned it a lot. What was my role in this situation? It's funny. I've been a fairly obscure poet and teacher most of the time. My books are good sellers for their presses, but my presses never expect to sell more than 200, 300 copies of a book. And I don't have the clout of a lot of my friends in the MFA world who were able to do more with the wealth of their families, frankly. So much of the art is back to the way it was in the 18th and 19th century. It is frankly a playground of at least the middle class, if not higher, because so much of it's done for free. And even if you are a poor person working in it, you often have wealth family-wise, or at least have access to the protection of your family's wealth, even if it's running out. So I've been a teacher the entire time. I've never once been tempted to try to make my living off my art, off of the podcasting, right? And I guess that does give me a certain amount of freedom. But yeah, to go back to it, that was my moment of like awakening. I've been flirting with Marxist economics for a while because I'd gone through most of the economic theories that were available to me, but modern monetary theory was not nearly as popular or understood back then. But I'd gone through Keynesianism and found it to be unsatisfactory. Can I master it? No. The thing is with a lot of these kind of economic or most philosophical schools of thought, if you make yourself master it before you feel like you can move on, you have invested enough time to have to believe in it. It's kind of the way it works. But I did take it seriously. I read multiple books on the topic, and I wouldn't just read one. I didn't find most Marxist explanations particularly good either. But at least I found that Marx something I could work with. Now, it often leads to me defending idiosyncratic things like Marx's theory of value, which is a modification of labor theory of value, about profit rates, about rents. And I often do actually, even as a Marxist, fundamentally more agree with what I hear out of like finance than I do any economist school. And when I talk about these things, you know what I'm reading? The Chamber of Commerce, financial reports. I'm not even reading the financial press as much anymore because it's also gone ideological. But because of that, many of the things that have been thrown at you guys and the partisan narrative and the Twitterati and all that shit that's been tying us up, I have been less concerned about. I'm a free speech Marxist, but I've never been pulled into the free speech wars. I knew they weren't that meaningful. That no side was sincere, and I could see that by economic actions. I've also not been caught up in this labor renewal thing. I want to believe it's true, and I do think the Starbucks unionization and the Amazon unionization matters, and I think the rank and file battles in the United Auto Workers matters, as well as this rank and file takeover, which took 10 years, by the way, in the railroad craft unions. But I also know what the stats are, and I actually watch the stats in so much that you can get them, and sometimes there's a year between the release. And since most journalists are tweet stenographers, and since Google goes by what's most popularly shared for your country, by the way, my Google experience completely changed when I came back to the US. One time someone asked me, someone asked me what I thought about Alexander Dugin being an anti-fascist, which just made me laugh. And I always pulled up an article from 2012 that used to be pretty common. It's in English about Dugin's endorsement of both Golden Dawn and Casa Pound. And also, I've also pointed out that a lot of the obsession with Dugin is overstated. It seems like maybe he's a PR actually more aimed at non-Russians than Russians. There's a lot to go on there, but I also couldn't find it. All I could find was Putin's brain or Putin's Rasputin when I looked in America. I got 4 pages of that on Google. That's not what I got. Now, a lot of it's the obsession has changed, and I've been in the country for 5 years. But so take that into the grain of thought here. But it's like Newsweek. In the 90s, there is this thing on Newsweek. That showed all the Newsweek covers. And Newsweek is a kind of conservative-ish publication anyway, but for everywhere but America. And America, you know, where it's supposedly based at, had the most trite cover. Now, people used to flash that as proof that Americans were stupid. Here's the one thing I can tell you. No people on Earth is more or less stupid than any other people on Earth. Like in aggregate. I've not met a dumb people, right? Including Americans. Complaining about Americans being stupid. Americans are ignorant about a lot of things. There are other things that other places are ignorant about too, that are counterintuitive. So the question actually got to me is like, no, why does this work here? Not if Americans are dumb. That's a bad question. Not a useful question. Right? Just statistically accurate. Why would a nationality define you in such a way that it would set all your intelligence? This doesn't make sense. Think about it for a minute. It doesn't make sense for any national group. Now, some of it is the laziness and ignorance of being a hegemon, which is a trend that goes back forever. Like not just the United States, the British were particularly daft when they were the world imperial power, as were the French. You know, they were technically superior in certain areas, and they had a complexity of knowledge. But if you asked them like general knowledge things, it would go down. And I think people often don't realize how brutal the past was. Somebody was complaining about the increase of sex work in the last few years. And I'm like, I'd like to see a proof of that. And do you mean OnlyFans? I guess maybe that might be true. But that just seems like actually the entrepreneurialization of sex work. But whether there's proof of it or not, every survey after survey says that people are dating less, having less sex, etc. in the developed world. In the United States, probably the most. From what I can tell, although that might be just the data we get because, you know, the whole weird problem. Right, industrialized, educated. What does the R stand for? Rich, yeah, and developed. It's a stupid acronym, but you get the point. Yeah, but unfunded, unequal public education, it's everywhere. I mean, it's the worst in the United States, but it's also bad in Britain and France, actually. And one of the most interesting tells is the longer your public education has been around and the more diverse your society, and right-wingers and racists love to run with this, but it's a fact we need to address, the worse your education tends to be. Like the oldest public education systems in the world, Britain, France, the US. US is the lowest of the three, but they're all kind of bad, actually, on the PISA outcomes. You know, and the U.S. actually does pretty okay with some of what it does in the schools, but it uses the schools for everything but schooling now. We're childcare. We're the only social services most children are allowed to have. And it's even hard for me to convince other leftists. I've been yelled at by leftists for being mad about this, but it is a problem because what's our mission? My mission is not, even though I am a partially online teacher, but my mission is not a lot of times if I'm an in-person teacher to educate anyone. Like, let's be honest. Yes, there's that people want these test scores to go up. Although we saw literacy decline starting in 2015 in the United States, and we've seen them in Britain as well. I don't know so much about France. Yet, I also know from being a public school teacher, and maybe this will shock some people, that for my poor students in particular, school was often the safest environment for them, even though it felt like a prison. And that's a kind of contradictory thing that you deal with. Like, you deal with students who are total punk asses, but they have really hard lives. Some of the punk asses are also privileged gets, but that's neither here nor there. And who yet, despite their opposition and the way they view teachers as the only element of the state they deal with and thus distrust them, they also often feel like their teacher is the only other person that cares about them other than their family. And that's a weird position to be in, actually. It's a contradiction. I've thought a lot about this last year because it's on my mind a lot. What kind of education would, now that the U.S. education system has really shown how weak it is, but it's true for a lot of the world, what would I actually want it to be? And the left, one of the reasons I got into Christopher Lasch was Christopher Lasch wrote honestly about how the John Dewey and the whole leftist school movement actually contributed to this, accelerated this. It was a move away from high academia, but it was also essentially aimed at turning work into jobs training. And while I do believe in vocational education, in fact, I believe everybody should get it, fucking frankly. I would have loved to learn how to lay bricks as a kid. I think our schooling is massively inefficient and way too geared towards college, but also not good at gearing people towards college. And college has been less and less valuable because of that as well. It devalues the degree, and it makes people focus on more and more basic skills as you go up. And in fact, in some ways, it's a way to put the cost of what you used to get from a public education or even like an 8th grade education onto you instead of the collective burden, because now you got to get it in remediation in university if you get it. And a lot of people are giving up on university, and I can't even blame them on that. The natural inclination of progressive teachers is to be soft on the students that have the most. Have the most problems, and I tend to think that's the worst thing you can do. I'm not here to prepare people for the world that should be. I have to deal with the world that is. But I don't want to succumb to the cynical realism of pretending the world that is all that could be. And see, that's the paradox of this podcast, of me talking about this year. Right? That is a real, earnest paradox. I've been doing this for a year and a half on my own. I've been podcasting for 13 years. And at the end of this, I'm going to talk to you about the new year because some things are changing here, because I need to write my 2 books, and I need to get my mental health a little bit more in control. Does gamification work? That's kind of a gamification can help, but there's no trick to any of this. All right. So we've had. I'm gonna take off my leftist pundit hat, where I talk about how we've been gaslit all year, and I'm gonna put on my. And I'm gonna talk about the Overton window. Liberty, don't do this, but let me do this. I'm gonna put on my my teacher hat. Since we've studied education, most of the things that we say are research based in education have been shown in meta analysis to actually be fads. Many of the things that we think work don't have a lot of evidence. Many of them are based on psychological research that there is no way is true. All right. Things like learning styles, they don't exist. There are learning preferences, and they're not necessarily the best way you learn. And assuming that you learn everything the same way is dumb. I do not learn how to fix a car the same way I learn how to do math. It's just not the way it works. And there's no one way, nor does your preference necessarily indicate that you know the way you learn. The reason why that was kind of cynically kept in schools for a long time was that theoretically, if you teach everything in multiple ways, it will stick for multiple people. Like, you'll have more ways for people to glom onto it, and it'll be more interesting, right? Like, but when you're down to people trying to sort people into chunks, and you have executive function now down to like 5 minutes for most students, what do? Well, you try to reduce it down to whatever their style is, which is just their preference. It shows no gains whatsoever, right? There's tons of that in education. New math versus algorithmic math. Well, neither work for everybody. That's part of the problem. But what I learned in the last 3 years of COVID is that people wanted me for social functions. They wanted me to help their kids socialize. And I think socialization is important, but I can't do it all. I am not a mentor, the guard, the teacher, the therapist triage. All right. So when I moved to online education, which I don't think is optimal, I've been a critic of online education before COVID. There are ways you can do it. You can use it to relieve stuff, right? It's not bad in and of itself, but it's always been overpromised. It works better for certain things than others. Like the idea that you can do elementary school online, to me, is like so farcically bad. Whereas in high school, you probably could do elements online, and I think we probably could actually make a lot of students' lives easier by putting certain elements online. You know, we do a lot of supports in what I do. I've been trying to bring more of the in-person stuff into online teaching and innovating there, but it's hard. Okay, back on pundit hat. All right. This is in the middle, so I'll get this and I'll get to the Overton window. Do you think if Marxism was taught seriously in high school and secondary schools in the UK, we'd be closer to society we prefer? No. I don't think it's about. I actually don't think it's about just education, and this is something where my Marxism hits like, I may even sound like Freddie DeBoer. Education's important, but education is going to hit the material limit of your society. I talk a lot about feedback loops and that stuff, but the feedback loops need to be based off of material rewarded. If I just teach you abstract Marxism, just like if I just teach you abstract neoclassical economics, it doesn't actually help you do most economic things in your life. There's study after study that does this. We add more and more financial literacy to economic classes. It doesn't do anything. we have to understand that indoctrination is not the same thing as living, starting to see the project of Marxism both as a political and research reality. It is not just about picking a better ideology. And this actually gets us to the Overton window. What is the Overton window about? It's about what is acceptable to say in an ideological space, but it doesn't say anything about the content of what is said. So what do I mean by that? More and more people aren't scared of socialism, particularly if they're under 40, but they also have less and less idea of what it might be. They think socialism is just public goods. I mean, the idea of what human liberation is, feels so incredibly vague. And for years, what is it? There's a good essay that came out. I believe it came out this year. It's already kind of dated because the neo-feudal talk has kind of fallen apart as our whole MMT neo-Fordism turn seems to be over. But the essay is The Critique of Techno-Feudal Reason. Came out in the New Left Review by Eugenie Morozov. It's a great essay. I'm going to do a whole episode of No Royal Road based on it next year with but I think we really are in this epoch where I'll read part of this essay. The decades-long recession of the progressive imagination is over. Apparently, the task of envisioning systemic alternatives has become much easier now that we are all allowed to work out dystopian options. For apparently, the long-awaited end of capitalism can merely be the beginning of something much worse. Late capitalism is certainly bad enough with this explosive cocktail of climate change, inequality, police brutality, and a deadly pandemic. But having made mass dystopia great again, some on the left have quietly moved to revise the Jamieson adage. Today, it's much easier to imagine the end of the world than it is a continuation of capitalism as we know it. The not so good news is that in undertaking the speculative exercise in apocalyptic scenario planning, the left has had a hard time differentiating itself from the right. That's another thing I've seen this year. See, I was talking about the problem of left and right, but people moving on it tend to be right wing, including all this recent populism stuff. Yet, in a real way, in a very real way, I can't tell the difference in the content on the political spectrum. It seems so muddled. The realignment has more been a great muddling. And the complexity of the situation, of the things you need to know and need to follow, makes that harder. And that you should be mad at left media for. We should be the people being honest and parsing this. But it's too great for any one person to do. Like, the amount of stuff I study in a given week now has gone from like mathematical theory to what's the latest news on epidemiological reports. What countries are even still doing them accurately? What do we know? Like, I never said boomers misunderstood what socialism is. I said most people who think they're socialists do. Boomer situation is actually quite interesting, but I have to point out that they're not the most reactionary generation in politics. I know that Conan Neutron gets mad whenever I say this and just starts talking about the statistics being specious, but in so much that Gen X votes, they vote not just Republican, but the most reactionary form of it. Now, I have my theories for why that happened. That they lived through the culmination of the Great Counter-Revolution. Their left was fractured. And it's really unfair to generalize about an entire generation like that. And in the case of Gen Xers, it really is unfair. But there's a sense in which they are more cynical about Democrats rightfully and don't know where else to go. Which is why I'm writing this essay and writing about Christopher Lasch and all this, because I think we have to clarify what we mean by this in our context. And I know I have a lot of worldwide audience, and so some of what I'm going to be writing in the future is going to be aimed at a worldwide perspective, and some of it's aimed at the U.S. Ironically, even though the U.S. dominates things, the U.S. does have a very poor understanding of its history before, say, 1960. That was like an epoch-changing time period, and the understanding of the U.S. own history between, say, 1820 to like 1945. I mean, and you know, some of that's in living memory of some people, my friends. It's actually really bad. And so we have to deal with that. There has been a generational loss of knowledge pre-Great Society, pre-New Deal. One of the stereotypes about Americans I do think is true is culturally we don't have a very long memory, or we know all that stuff about us being a new country and a new culture is horseshit. We remember, for example, that like the concept of German is actually fairly recent. So I have a much larger audience now than when I started an hour ago. And then when I started an hour ago is when I said the important stuff. Remember, you've been gaslit this year. If you're in the United States, you've been pulled back into a major party. If you're not into the United States, you probably have been sold a bunch of stuff about what was possible that you didn't do the stuff to make possible. And I'm not going to blame it on you because you didn't have the right information. We have to start building heuristics and start sharing this information as best as we can. And left media by itself is not good for this. And people ask me why I don't do more local organization stuff. I'll cover union stuff when I can. But my audience is way too diffuse. There's people here from all over the world. I have while I think the plurality of my audience is in America, there is something like 35 to 40% on any given stream that isn't. And when you talk about the United States, in Canada, you're dealing with also very big, very, very legally diverse areas. And that's what we need to start dealing with. Oh, this is interesting. Is it possible to have a fair worldwide tax system to make things better? Do we even need a transition out of democratic socialism if we ever get to that? I think you're going to find that a state requires class to exist. You have to have different classes of people, and you have to abstract surplus in a certain way to have a state. Now, we're always going to have to extract some surplus value to take care of those who can't work and to keep social goods going and stuff like that. I'm not one of those people who thinks you ever even could give everyone all the product of their labor. In fact, Marx mocks that in a critique of the Goethe program. But I do think we need to think about this not in terms of taxes or income equality. I mean, income equality is important, I guess, but it should be more a result of our policies, not the goal of our policies. And I know that sounds very strange to socialists. You see, we're not just about equalizing income. The reason why you want to equalize income is because that equalizes power. But we've been dealing with a media system that has been one of the things about American media that's so ironic is neoliberalization means that you don't need public propaganda anymore because you just hire reporters who mostly report on tweets and whatnot, because you can get a few elite reporters and pay them a little bit to do that, but you don't have to pay them to go off around the world and get the actual information when I don't know, you can just report on the latest tweet or whatever public agency. And conversely, the people who do get worldwide access, now that we don't have large companies involved in that paying for it, have to go under state auspices. So they have to say certain things. And if you don't understand that, and I'm not saying that to like op jacket people, I've been accused of that before. As a person who has been stuck in a country with my visa not valid because of political situations, trust me, I know the harrowing nature of it. But guess what? I'm not doing in that situation. Not reporting on that country. When I lived in Egypt, you would have never heard me talk about it. What's your thoughts on that regarding the upcoming economic crisis of 2023? Well, it's already happening. GDP growth has slowed. The West is experiencing decent, but it's going to fall out in the tech sector. It's not going to look like 2007 because it's not about housing here, although it may be about housing in Canada and Europe because they have different structure to their loans. While they're lower interest, they can go up really quick. I think it's real hard. I think we're gonna. I think we have to prepare ourselves for the fact that we can't predict all of what this economic downturn is going to do. But here's what I say: we can predict off of current trends. One, the tech sector is going to have more and more layoffs. The profitability of the tech sector was based off ad revenues being able to be leveraged off of the low cost of debt, apparently, and as debt has become more expensive, that's completely gone away from them. They don't have any other commodities to really play with, and it's unclear if the ad revenues were ever particularly lucrative. So as profit margins get tighter, you're unlikely to see you see more and more companies use whatever reason, whether it's Musk fiasco or whatever, to pull out of social media advertising because it doesn't look like it actually pays for itself. You're going to see the COVID stuff privatized more and more at a moment where there might be more layoffs. Well, by tech sector, I mean specifically internet-based businesses, largely off of the movement of commodity. I don't mean technological development, but I'm seeing it across the board in anything that's heavily invested into the internet or internet advertising or social media or disruption or any of that shit. Ad tech, social media tech, a lot of software development. Stuff that's in the rentier part of the tech economy. But it's fair point to say that tech sector is really broad. Here's the problem. Like, you have to ask me to be more specific because I also can't parse these statistics a whole lot. Varn, what's your take on AI taking over human artists? Out of the many things this year that people are really upset about, this has been happening for a long time. I am not worried about the technology. I'm worried about its marketization. That's where I'm at. But it's not like artists were making a stable living anyway, as many people are saying. I'm also not as a person who makes money off of like poetry. I'm not really worried about the fact that like an AI could steal my job as a poet, but it can't do what I do. But I am thinking about how we're going to have to change school because the chatbots can replicate what a freshman student can do. It can't write anything of immense subtlety or whatever, but it doesn't need to. Many tech workers are getting hired very quickly in other sectors. Yeah, I mean, that's true. I suspect we'll find out, though, that a lot of that work is less pay. One thing I will say, there's a tendency on the left to over, we over predict crises, but we have one due. And I do think the inflation was a sign of one coming. I'm not one of these leftists who's trying to say inflation is good for the worker because of blah. That's wow. Talking about defining worker in a very narrow, myopic way. But and particularly if you're outside of the developed world. Sorry, Jacobin, you guys should have shut the fuck up with that shit. Or Seth Ackerman, particularly, he wrote many articles about it in 2021. Yes, there is such a thing as too much of a reserve army of labor. There's definitely such a thing as too much of a reserve army of labor. How much agency do we really have? Is free will an illusion, or are we solely determined by the material state of our brain? Don't ask yourself, is free will an illusion? That's a malformed question. Nothing counter-causal exists, but that doesn't mean that agency is meaningless, nor do we understand what the neurology indicates. I think we always worry too much about this question of do we have free will? I mean, one, if you don't, you can't control even that question. So why are you fucking asking it? And two, I think the idea of free versus unfree, as in totally self-caused versus untotally self-caused, is malformed. Anyway, but do I think you can just think? What about agency? I think the real question you should ask is, what is your political agency really? What is it? What is your political agency really? That's a more interesting question to me than whether or not we can figure out if our brain can completely come up with its own thought outside of nothing, which I think we're just going to find out it's way too complicated to phrase in that way. I'm going to have to pivot now. I have some interesting questions I'm going to ask. I wasn't planning on doing a Q&A today. This was a reflection of a year review, recap. We were told something in the beginning of the year about labor. That wasn't true. We were told a lot of stuff about COVID. That was misrepresented. We were told a lot of stuff, even by leftists, about where we were politically, and most of that's a lie. We're further away from even discussing Medicare for all. All that's basic. Let's talk about this other stuff now. In my mind, it seems reasonable to expect to see the Volcker shock's impact in Latin America on much more of the world, since there's much more consumer and corporate debt in the world. No, yes, there's a lot of cost. It's going to lead to some decoupling, but a lot of these places are actually also in declining revenues and other things. You've seen everyone's GDP dip. I mean, Europe is declining faster than anyone could have expected. Even me, who's a noted people give Europe too much credit guy, has been like, oh my God, that's happening faster than I thought. Latin America's pink wave stuff is going to be very limited by this, and most of the pink wave stuff is over, except in Brazil. And the Workers' Party is actually pretty weak electorally. It's just Lula personally that is doing well. It's a hard thing not to take and really parse out, right? Political agency is a complicated thing, and a lot of us want to inject it on stuff like on international politics and war, which is frankly where you have the least political agency, particularly now that we can't do things like work stoppages and whatnot. So that's where we are. Do you have a book list online around cybernetics? And I'm trying to remember the term you use for when systems get too complex. I just talk about complexity theory. Or Klug or Kluge, both are used for when systems are too complex. Cybernetic theory, start with Stafford Beer and Norbert Wiener. This is a case where the classics actually are better. But I have more coming up on that. Do you think when U.S. and China truly pull ahead, they'll think if we're... Do you think when the U.S. and China truly pull ahead, they'll think if we'll do socialism now? I don't know what that means. Sorry. Do you think if China pulls ahead? I am... I think the project of communism in China was pretty much dashed in 1980, maybe 1978. I think the current problems with zero COVID has been an indication that the Chinese state has not been investing in its medical capacity as much as we had thought. Although zero COVID was more effective than thought, but it was coming at too high of an economic cost, even for Xi. And there we are. Do I think that China is going to pull ahead and we'll do socialism? China doesn't even have socialized medicine, not consistently. So, oh yeah. So I don't know. I think a lot of, I mean, the one thing I'll give China is it's a responsible international actor, and I do generally mean that. I tend to see it as probably the most rational of the current states. I also think there is an element in the CPC that is sincere about its want to get out of capitalism. But as of right now, there's no indication that is on the immediate horizon. And their GDP has slowed down to that of a quote mature capitalist economy. Some of that may pick up with zero COVID, but there's a whole lot of stuff going on in China we don't understand. And I, particularly looking at all the COVID rates and statistics and stuff, I don't feel comfortable commenting on it. I don't feel like anything I say from either Western or China's government agency, frankly, is going to reflect the truth. The Belt and Road Initiative has largely been scuttled between the sovereign debt crisis and the Russia-Ukraine war. And it's China has no want to play the IMF, so that's going to be hard for them to do. I thought the Belt and Road Initiative was actually really kind of brilliant as like the super Marshall Plan. It's a capitalist plan, but it's at least one that proposes an alternate system that would, without alienating the Western powers, actually create alternate roads and give other states means of competition with them. But again, not socialism. And two, now it's coming to real headwinds. The way the IMF is leveraging sovereign debt restructuring, particularly in Sri Lanka, is putting India and China in competition with each other before the IMF relief will come in, which means that it's going to be very hard for the relief packages to be I don't have a favorite country. What's your favorite country politically and human rights wise? I don't have a favorite country human rights wise. Asterisks. I think human rights may not be that helpful of a concept on asterisks, but I think Iceland's cool, and my favorite country is Mexico. That is where I intend to die, like a good gringo south of the border, not invading. Have my views shifted on Ukraine since the war started? Yes, it has. I thought that Zelensky would realize that even if they won, the best they could do was turn it to a bloody quagmire, and that this would eventually lead to a proposition of escalation that would completely destroy Ukrainian civil society, and thus Zelensky would be bitter at the West. He may be bitter at the West, but he's still playing the game. I called that wrong. I also think that my initial feeling that Russia, I mean, I need to own this, that I had a very Mearsheimer realist response that Russia was probably going to do some stuff with the separatist republics and call it a day, just to reassert itself. And they definitely did more than that. I also have the unpopular opinion of thinking both sides are responsible and for what has happened. But then there's no way to spin this as Russia not starting the war, even though I totally agree with a lot of the analysis that says that this was set up by the West. It was also set up by Russia's own responses. So I'm not a Trotskyist, but that's funny. So yeah, there you go. I would say even political parties are premature. That's what I think a lot of our problems is we haven't built the stuff to make political parties viable. I'm against political creationism, which is the idea that you can just try to pull up the conditions by political programs or fiats. It's a feedback loop. And that feedback loop is going to take a long time to build. But I'm not such an ultra leftist that I don't think political parties are eventually necessary. I do, but I think they have to mean something different than what we mean by them now. Political parties in America have a very delimited meaning, very different than what they did in Europe in the 19th century. The tradition is different. Yeah. So the one thing I will say, and this is my last comment before I talk about where the show is going, because I've been on longer than I was expecting. This is my only live recording. There are plenty of recordings for people to comment on, and I will maybe even see the comments. But I have pre-recorded probably up until the middle of January, maybe a little later. I have to get my work-life balance again. I have a full-time job. So just to remind people that this is not my primary means of making a living, and never will be, probably. I kind of hope it never is. So let's talk about the show for a second. I do a lot of stuff on the Patreon, and so I want to talk about that too. This is not just Patreon ad. I'm happy with my Patreon where it's at. I'll always take more, but I'm not into pressuring people for more. But we are going to continue the diving into the wreckage, but we're going to start splitting it up between the analysis of what's going wrong, and maybe we're going to start doing episodes on what principles could we start to develop to start getting past that. I am not just here to beat you over the head with everything we're doing wrong. And that's the problem with a lot of left critique. You only hear what's wrong, or you get sold on what we need to talk more about what's going on. So diving into the wreckage will continue. No Royal Road will come back. That No Royal Road is a audio only show that I do with the Regrettable Century Brothers. For those of you who don't know, one of the Greta Rusinski brothers at the beginning of the year had a massive head injury from a car wreck, and he has returned and is thankfully, mostly functional, but it was very bad. So that's why we stopped. It was not because I didn't want to do it, or they didn't want to do it. It was because Jason had to heal. I am probably going to be doing less of these solo streams because I like them, but I don't love, there's always a temptation for me to get in a fight with my audience, which is not good for anybody. I mean, people enjoy it because they're fucking weird, but the Icelanders are showing up. You just have really good yogurt. I don't need anyone to, like you said, I don't feel bad for anyone being a woker. I try to make the important elements of this free. There's a reason why. Yeah, conflict builds a narrative, So that's going to continue. I'm stopping the nailing it down for a while. I still have them planned. I've been writing the scripts. But my head hurts. We're doing a series on nationalism with Jean Bajelon that's going to go through the major left books on what nationalism is and talk about the different theories and try to talk about the historical debates around the national question and the cul-de-sacs. And I'm not going to tell you we're going to come to any answers. I'm not sure, but the national question stuff is the stuff that sends me into knots. I will totally admit I don't have an answer to a lot of the problems that come up. But we're going to explore it honestly. That's going to be nailing it down for a while. The solo nailing it down will return probably in the summer because this is a limited series with Gene. I hope you find it useful. For Patreons, that means that there's less Q&As a month. But there will still be at least one or two a month. And so that's that. Mortal Science may be coming back. Asterisk, maybe. Pop the Left may be coming back. Asterisk, maybe. But I'm definitely writing a series of books of essays that I hope to become a book. Because a lot of people why doesn't Varn publish more? And to be honest, I talk about my dyslexia and aphasia, and that's very real. But I have an MFA. I am a trained writer. My early drafts are unreadable, but my late drafts are pretty good. So I'm going to sit down. It just takes time, and honestly, over the past 10 years, more and more of my time's gone to podcasting, less and less of it's gone to writing. So I'm going to write stuff down. The first essay is going to be on the historical development of the concepts of the left and why it may be a problem. But why most people say they get beyond, left and right, end up being right wing. I have a theory as to why that is, but I need to spell it out and work it through it and be rigorous about how I work through it logically. A certain amount of logical rigor. And I'm not actually approaching it from a Marxist standpoint only. I actually think you have to justify these things multiple ways. Yeah, I actually do think market economies function with civic nationalism. I actually think that's why civic nationalism and the nation state is a dominant form of governance for capital. But it's not the only form of social trust. And in fact, it's actually kind of bad at it in certain situations. And that's what we need to discuss and pick apart and deal with. So those are the changes. So the solo shows will still happen. They're just going to happen when I have time. I'm going to be writing more. Aphasia is dyslexia is an intake issue. Aphasia is an outtake issue. So there's multiple kinds of aphasias. There's Broca's aphasia, and there's aphasia you get with old age. I have an aphasia where it's hard for me to write negations down. Don't know why. If you follow my Twitter and Facebook, you'll see it. You'll notice that not is often missing from a key part of the phrase. And I don't see missing words when I spell them out in a sentence. It's true for everybody. Mine's just on a more well, I'm not touching the transversal. It's just mine's more pronounced than most people's. So that's what aphasia is. A lot of the most common forms of aphasia, though, are like people who have the inability to like speak certain sentences, particularly as they age. There are a bunch of different kinds of aphasias. So yeah. Okay. So those are the changes. To recap real fast. No Railroad's coming back. All the collaborative shows are starting. There is a possibility that Pop the Left comes back. Doug Lane and I are talking about it, but there's still stuff to work out. Doug's and my politics have kind of changed from each other as well. Or maybe not Doug so much as Sublations, but we'll see. But I do think every now and then Doug asks me the right questions. And we'll stand up to each other. So we'll see. I'm not sure yet. So those are the changes in the new year. Slightly nailing it down is going to be a series for a while on nationalism. It's going to be dedicated to one topic so I can do it correctly. I can't cover nationalism, even a series of 15-minute shorts. It's got to be done right. And I'm going to be spending more time on writing. It's going to be more pre-records because I still want to give you, at least one show a week, maybe usually two. But it's going to be done, when I can do them. And my schedule is weird. Like I have, I'm a teacher. There's times where I can do like 5 interviews in a week. I've done 3 in a day. But I can't always maintain like the live streamer stuff. I should start Negation Media. That's what I should start. But I think there's already Negation Magazine. I don't want to step on their turf. You should check them out, by the way. I'd like to thank new patron backers. This has got to do the Rentier part of the show. Josh B. and Ben W. Thank you so much for supporting us at the Khan El Kahanan level. Also the Fermi paradox. Oh my God. Oh man, I don't even want to touch that. There's a lot of assumptions in the Fermi paradox. Do you have any recommended readings on IP rent capture? Yes, hearing you speak on it, it's reframed how I've seen things, and I'd like to learn more about it. Honestly, that's hard. I have just been following stock reports for it, like this movement, and you'll notice it in everything. But it started in non-tangibles like music downloads. You moved from purchasing the album, the purchasing digital rights to subscription. But what you started noticing is over time, if you look at the declining rates of GDP and look at profit rates in specific sectors, people just started forgoing the possibility of more profits to pricing stability. And Rentier is pricing stability. But the thing is, that seems to be tied somehow in a way that's unclear to me. And I'm trying to read more of this. And if I read a book that explains it well, I'll suggest it to you. On the relationship between the price of debt and the ability to command rents. So yeah. Is Doug still a Zizekian Gnostic? Probably. Thoughts on why I can't finish your PhD? Probably your dissertation being harder to finish. I put my last book on hold so my partner can finish my partner in the book, not my life partner, can finish her dissertation. Shawn is really working on a history of Gen X, and man, it's hard to stay motivated when you know what the academic market's like. What kind of scenario does a Great Britain face next decade? Oh man, not British. but it looks bad. Your poverty rate's higher than ours, and ours was never great. You don't have that many trading partners, and you've seen your ability to command rents off of being part of a reserve currency crash. It don't look good. Varn, are you trial free on purpose? No. Well, I am now. Uh, my complicated, but that's not a question I'm willing to answer in public, actually. But it's complicated. Let's just leave it at that. Do you think Zizek's more conservative? I don't have a Zizek's a Lacanian, and I tend to think there is a tension between the liberatory and conservative elements of Lacanian thinking. I also tend to think a lot of it is like that it moves around too much. It's not as substantive people think. Okay, so those are the changes in the show. There's still going to be at least 6 episodes on the YouTube channel a month and 4 to 6 episodes in the free podcast. All the important things remain free. I know that's bad business policy, but it's good for me as a person and justifies what I do. Thank those of you who support me, though. You do make this easier. You pay for me to keep up the equipment. You pay for me to do a lot of things. And you've also, frankly, made it where I could visit my family earlier in the year. So I thank you for that. Well, yeah. Thanks. I'm going to go lay down. I am impossibly tired. Christmas and Hanukkah, and I fucking hate Christmas. I hate to be the Grinch, but I really hate it. I really want to embrace like it's cheer, New Year, and people being irrationally exuberant, but it's not for me. But anyway, I hope you all had a good holidays. I hope you have a good New Year, and I hope you keep fighting the good fight. And I do think you guys need to think through some of the cul-de-sacs, because I do feel like we've been led. You know, I feel like we've been really gaslit this year. Happy holidays, peace be upon you, etc., etc.